Thank you so much, Ed. I appreciate that very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here tonight to share with you my area of expertise within tourism. I see my role tonight as the storyteller. So I'm going to tell you the story as I've heard it over the last few years of what's been happening with marijuana tourism in Colorado. My goal for the next hour or so is to review what my narrow area of expertise is, talk about some key events in our brief history with marijuana tourism, share with you what I've heard is the most recent statewide research on marijuana tourism, talk about how we're affected down here in Durango with some local tax data, and then through all of this, I'll sprinkle in the results from my own personal research. And then unfortunately, I'm going to leave you tonight with more unanswered questions than questions that I will be able to answer, but they are things that are on the radar that we are thinking about in the academic community and the tourism community as concerns that we have moving forward. Just so that we're clear, especially for the question section at the end, my narrow field of research is about tourist decision-making and their motivations for why they come here, marijuana being one of them. I am not an expert in using, selling, growing marijuana, or some other very serious issues like legal issues, law enforcement, health issues, banking issues, and the taxes associated with marijuana. So while those are important topics, they're not in my scope of expertise. In addition to being a storyteller, I would like you to think of my interest and approach to understanding marijuana tourism as a social scientist. I am a neutral observer of a phenomenon. I have no vested interest in the outcome of my research and really am just a curious person who is there at the right time to ask the questions. So, as Ed very graciously helped introduce our timeline of marijuana in Colorado, we actually began in 1975 by reducing penalties for possession. So we were one of the early movements of states who did that. 2000, we passed Amendment 20, that was for medical marijuana. Many of you were probably here in November 2012 when we passed Amendment 64 for retail marijuana. And then as Ed mentioned, we started January 1st, 2014, mostly in Denver, but down here in Southwest Colorado, there was a shop in Telluride that opened up January 1st. But in terms of the rest of our region, the shops in Durango and Pagosa were much later in the year, and they opened up September, October, November, at least the first shops did in 2014. So where's my part in the story begins? I came here in the summer of 2013. I started at Fort Lewis in the fall of 2013. And so I came in after the vote had been made, but before we had gone legal, and everyone was in a state of paranoia, basically, is how I felt when I was thrown into what happened. One of my first responsibilities in my position was to be the Fort Lewis representative at the Colorado Governor's Tourism Conference in Telluride that year. This is a horrible place for a work trip, as you can see. This picture is from the balcony of the Peaks Resort. We'd had a snow the night before, and then the leaves were changing. It was incredible. But so this was October of 13, right before we were legalizing in January, and everyone was in a panic, to be honest. And no matter what the topic of the session was, it always ended in unanswered questions about marijuana tourism. And I'm going to mention the Colorado Tourism Office, or I might call them the CTO. They're the mothership when it comes to managing and marketing tourism in the state of Colorado. Our Durango Area Tourism Office, or DATO, that's their acronym, they follow the lead of the CTO all the time. A lot of the unanswered questions were being posed to the CTO and what their plans were, how they were going to handle managing, promoting, researching what was happening with marijuana tourism. And their response at that point was very hands-off. They said, we can't use any of our public funding and use any tax money devoted to promoting it or even researching it to understand it. So they were very hesitant to get involved in at all and just had a we'll see what happens kind of attitude at that point. So me being new to Colorado and finishing my dissertation and knowing I needed to start a new research stream, and as a naturally curious person, just figured that someone needed to answer or ask those questions, and that if no one else was going to do it, I was going to be the one. And so that's really where my interest started in marijuana tourism. So over the next year, we designed and developed and implemented a study. I did this through independent studies with Fort Lewis College undergrad students. There's no shortage of undergrads who want to take an independent study in marijuana tourism. And so I rotated students every semester. And this first phase of research was really from that very first window of time that we were open and legal with marijuana in our region. There were two different segments of this phase one. The first were qualitative interviews. So in fall of 14, we interviewed 6 people who were owners and or managers of retail stores. What these 6 people had in common is they were owners and managers of medical stores beforehand. So they were all going through the transition of previously owning a medical dispensary and now owning a retail shop. The thing they had that was not in common is that they were located in 3 counties. To protect their identity, I cannot tell you what those counties are, but you could probably imagine where you know the locations are in our region in Southwest Colorado. So based on those interviews, what we found was their shared experience of this transition as being the first movers in retail marijuana in our region. They shared a lot of concerns about constantly changing industry regulations. You had to be very invested as a business owner at this time to be successful. Things were changing weekly, to be honest, and they had to stay on top of that, or there were serious fines or the potential that the businesses could be closed. They also how they plan to maintain competitive advantage, especially with new and more shops opening all the time. Some challenges with staffing and training and hiring in this new industry. Issues with security came up a lot, especially because it's a cash-only business, and that's something we'll talk about more in a moment. Also, some challenges with marketing, especially in terms of marketing to tourists. It is illegal to put any marijuana material in your promotions that could be seen outside of the state of Colorado. So they have to be very careful about that, but still identified that tourists were a market. And then finally, another thing they mentioned was varying levels of community support. So depending on which county they were in, they would have different levels of public support, and then also different levels of support from their tourism board. Some of the stores were actively promoted in the visitor center, and some of them weren't. What I think was the most interesting thing that came out of the interviews was what they would say about the tourism segment. And this is my favorite quote, and it was echoed by most of the interviewees. And it basically says that they are not coming here just to purchase marijuana. They are coming here for the many other amazing things that Colorado offers. And it's the icing on the cake that they happen to also get to purchase legal marijuana while they're here. And so whether or not marijuana was the primary driver for them to visit Colorado is something that is a question that continues to be brought up in research since this time. So that was the interviews. We also did surveys that started in spring 2015. So this was when the Southwest shops had been open for about 6 months. So within that window, we had 325 customers who came to the region. We intercepted them at the shop, usually after they had just made a purchase. The participants included in this survey were tourists and residents. And so the profile that I'll share with you shows the difference between tourists and residents based on things like demographics, their purchasing behavior, and my personal interest in doing this research. As an academic, I have research requirements, and my goal is to eventually get published in an academic journal about the motivations of marijuana tourists. And so you'll be hearing a lot about motivations tonight because that's my personal interest in getting published and getting tenure one day. So in terms of demographics, the blue bars are the tourists and the orange bars are the residents. This is age. You'll notice that the largest column for both categories is the 21 to 25 category. I want to point out something here, and for all of the charts that I'm going to show you tonight, every piece of data that we have has been provided by the people who chose to take the survey. And even though we had scientific ways of recruiting our sample, there will always be sample bias if there are differences in the people who chose not to take the survey. So the data that we have for the people who chose to take the survey were fairly young, 21 to 25, but you will see that the tourists are older than the residents. So orange is resident, so they were higher in the 21 to 25 category, but then we have 40 40s, 50s, and 60s where the tourists were older. So that's something that's interesting, especially for business managers, to know that the older clientele who are coming on are likely coming from out of town. In terms of frequency of use, I mean, this chart shocks me every time that I see it, to be honest with you. For both tourists and residents, the overwhelming majority of people were everyday users or daily users. So over 200 of the 325 people are using cannabis products every day. Another difference that we found between tourists and residents, again, tourists are blue and residents are orange, is the difference in the purchase of edibles. So tourists were more likely to purchase edibles at a significant level than the residents. There are a number of reasons why we think this might be. For people who are new to a variety of different products, edibles I've been told anecdotally that they could be the training wheels to THC. If they're scared about smoking or the other paraphernalia that's associated with some of these products, that edibles might be a way to sort of get your foot in the door. Also, I've been told that edibles are easier to bring over the border. And it is important to note that it is illegal to bring cannabis products that you purchase legally in the state of Colorado into a state where it is not legal. But anecdotally, that edibles are easier for tourists to leave with. So that was a significant difference there. In terms of their spending, we weren't surprised to see that tourists spent significantly more. Residents can go back tomorrow or next week or next month, and they don't have the need to have a big transaction at a single time like tourists do. So tourists are spending over $100 a transaction. And again, for a business owner, that's really interesting to know that you have an opportunity with tourists to have a bigger ticket perhaps than with residents. And a lot of that has to do with the time that you spend with them and the education that you offer on the products. My personal research is in the planning phase, and so I am interested in what types of information sources they're looking at. What is an interesting discrepancy here is when we did the interviews with the managers and owners, they were very focused on paid advertising. So they talked a lot about newspaper and radio and doing all of this research on which stations on the radio had fewer than 30% of listeners under the age of 21, which is a requirement to have paid advertising on the radio for marijuana. And my research says that that's a waste of their time, because the tourists and the residents are most likely to use the internet and use word of mouth. And you'll see the tourists who are blue were most likely to use the internet. They may feel uncomfortable asking people. They may feel uncomfortable accessing resources that they're unaware of in a foreign place, but they do know how to use the web, and there are some pretty decent databases out there that provide information about which shops are open. They have user reviews, so you can see what's available and also find maps with locations. What's interesting to me is that the residents were most likely to use word of mouth in their network of people who are cannabis users. They talk to one another and find out who's got the best service and who's got the best products. That being said, service and product quality was not the most important reason why people would choose one shop over another. That was location. In almost every interview I did, every manager or owner told me that they had the best customer service and the best product quality. And it turns out that that isn't what's most important. It's the shop with the best location that will be selected in terms of importance of the attributes. All right, so here's an introduction into my interests with the motivations. This is tiny, and I'll just help you to show you what's most important, is that of all these motivations that were provided, and these are all customers, so these are tourists and residents, and these people are also daily users. So these people likely had access to cannabis before we had legal marijuana, and they're choosing to go to the store and pay higher prices with the tax associated with it so they can have access to safe products. And so this is very important that 6 months into the legalization of marijuana in our region, that this is the number one motivator. This is so tiny, and I'm so sorry, but my goal with my research is to develop motivations, excuse me. I'm so sorry. Yes.
Go back to the previous one. I'm
This
not
one?
sure I see why that's so much above the others. Number.
You're right. I, just for the sake of this presentation, wanted to be able to highlight in order which was the highest. But compared to I have nowhere else to purchase, so for example, that would be a significant difference. I'm so sorry. Okay, so moving on to this giant list of motivations. There's a small amount of literature about this topic. My job to get published in academic journals, I must do a literature review and review all of the previous literature that's been done about this topic. And the truth is that amount of literature is very small. One study that was done internationally is by my buddy Bill Hassan, who helped me look at the validity of this scale. And he did a qualitative study. So he did interviews, and based on his interviews with drug tourists, is what he called it, in mostly Europe, he found 4 different categories or clusters or dimensions of different motivations. And so my goal with my research is to develop a scale, a way to quantitatively measure these 4 different clusters. The truth is the statistics that go further into this showed that it was not 4, it's actually 2, and I'll show you that later in the presentation. But just to point out the ones that were highest on this list, this is an outcome of my free choice, and that is something that we'll see again in terms of their highest motivation. And then this place is a must for marijuana users was the second highest motivation. And those were both in the cluster or dimension called Quest for Authenticity. Okay, the most important thing that, at least for me, to make conclusions out of this research was whether or not marijuana was the primary reason for their visit. This is strongly agree over on this end, and you'll see that that bar is the tallest. But when it's weighted against all of the other responses, this question was asked just to the tourists, not to the residents, and there were about 160 tourists. And so just over 60 of the 160 said it was their primary reason, and these are the people who chose to take the survey. If you look at that weighted against all the rest of them, we come out with an average of 4.7, which is basically somewhere between neither agree nor disagree and slightly agree. So based on what I learned from my interviews, based on what I learned from these surveys, based on anecdotal evidence from other conversations I've had, I started to disseminate this research, present at academic conferences, and I had my first public statement on December 6, 2000. In the Durango Herald, and was quoted that marijuana is not a major tourism driver. If you drill down further, I very clearly say that my stance is that it gives us a slight competitive advantage. So I was very proud of this, heard from my parents in Denver that they had heard from their friends that I was quoted on December 6th saying marijuana is not a major tourism driver. 3 days later, the Denver Post on the front page has a headline that says marijuana has huge influence on Colorado tourism. So what had happened is this reporter, whether it was intended or unintended, had misinterpreted and misrepresented some data that the Colorado Tourism Office's marketing research firm had done. Basically, they had asked a question that had a vague response option, and it combined, does marijuana make you less likely to visit, and does marijuana make you more likely to visit? And he had combined those 2 levels and said that 40% of people said that it was a huge influence, implying that it was positive when really it was half of that was positive and half of it was negative, which was nearly a wash. So this is at 8:10 a.m. This is posted. It's also on the front page of the hard copy, and you know those never disappear. And so I'm sure the Colorado Tourism Office heard about this first thing and had an immediate response. They contacted the Herald, and then at 9:52 a.m., that headline was changed to Colorado Tourism Survey Shows Legal Marijuana's Influence, which made me feel better because their stats actually matched my stats, and I wasn't the laughingstock of my family anymore. But the point is that that information had already gone out. People had already seen huge influence, and that had made an impact. The CTO responded the following day and sent out a press release that basically said, we want to clarify what happened yesterday, explain why it happened, and give you the real numbers. They also contacted the Denver Business Journal and had another article released saying it's not a major draw for the state. But to be honest with you, the damage had already been done. Here's an email I got later that day after the press release and the new article in the Denver Business Journal. This is a gentleman, Mike Elliott, who is actually very helpful to me in the survey development phase. He is with Marijuana Industry Group, which is an advocacy group out of Denver. He's no longer there, but when he was there, he collected most reporting about marijuana across the country, and then he would distribute that to his listserv. And so that was actually very helpful for me. He was like my research assistant and would send me things that I wasn't aware of. And then here, he has the opportunity to send this misinformed headline from the Denver Post. And so this is just an example of why that was so significant. So why is this important to the CTO? You may or may not be familiar with the Come to Life campaign. I'll read these taglines to you because they're pretty great, but hard to read. What has happened since I moved to Colorado is we've seen a dramatic increase in tourism, in the number of people, in the spending, in the jobs, in the tax revenue. And it's very difficult to know in that period of time, since marijuana has been legal, they've also put out this very successful Come to Life marketing campaign. So we don't know how much of this success can be attributed to the marketing campaign or the fact that we have legal marijuana now. Why is the CTO so upset about this huge influence on tourism? Because their Come to Life campaign is very family friendly and kid focused. So here's a girl in a field. The tagline is, "This is a world still worth exploring." Here's a father hiking with his sons. "Hold on to your willingness to be awed." I'm not sure the age of the taller person, but I think the smaller person's definitely a child. Some things happen exactly once. And then some billboards, "How sublime it is to be small," in reference to our relationship to the mountains and also going skiing with your children. And then here you can take epic pictures of your kids at the end of a hike. "We don't need wings to touch the sky." So basically, the CTO is in a position where they had invested a lot of money into this campaign, which by all measurements has been very successful, but it was going after a very different target market than the marijuana tourist. And so they put out around that time an official statement that said the Colorado Tourism Office has positioned Colorado as a premier four-season destination, and the organization has no plans to use legal marijuana to promote the state. And they can't actually. Have any of you seen that Come to Life campaign before? You probably wouldn't, because you're not their target market. These ads go to places outside of the state of Colorado so that those people want to come here and spend their money here. And so the idea is, if their whole goal is to market outside of the state of Colorado, it is illegal for them to put any cannabis-related material in their marketing. So it was a definite conflict that they had to be promoting Colorado outside of the state and be implying that they should be promoting marijuana in some way, which is illegal for them to do in their marketing. All right, so that's sort of some key events in our recent history. And then to bring you up to date to how things are going today, last month I went to the Colorado Governor's Tourism Conference. This year it was in Breckenridge, also a pretty amazing place to have a work trip. And what we learned there was we were finally introduced to Denise Miller, and she's with Strategic Marketing Research Insights, and that's the marketing research firm that the Colorado Tourism Office uses. Remember when I was at my first conference, I said that they were very hesitant to devote tax dollars to researching marijuana? Well, what they did, because they eventually realized that they needed to study it, they didn't have a separate study just for marijuana. They used this SMARI study, which we've had for quite some time, and it really initially was meant to measure ad effectiveness. And what they did was they added marijuana questions to the existing ad effectiveness survey. So they were able to get comfortable with devoting resources to researching it. So this is tiny, and I will try to explain this to you. So here is the breakdown of legal marijuana and the type of influence it had on your likelihood to visit. The big orange bars are no influence. Let me rewind for a second. The sample for this study is a nationwide panel of potential visitors. So they are people from anywhere in the country, all demographic, socioeconomic backgrounds. They're asked if they were exposed to the Colorado Come to Life campaign at any time. They answer a lot of questions about the campaign, and then they also included these questions about marijuana. And so the big orange bars are people who said that legal marijuana had no influence on my visit. And that's why the Denver Post headline that said it was a huge influence was really a misconception and misled people, because the big orange bars say that clearly most people said it didn't influence them either way. The blue bars are people who were less likely to visit, and so the first time this question was asked back in summer of 13, we were at 19%, and that's dropped down to 16% in the most recent survey. The winter 2016 survey means that it was for people who would be traveling in winter of 16. It wasn't done in winter of 16, obviously. But that went down to 16. So we've seen a very slight drop in the people who are less likely to visit. In terms of people who are more likely to visit, we've seen a bigger increase there. We started at 9% in summer of 13, and we've gone up to 20% in the most recent survey. Again, with all of the data that I provide today, I want you to take this with a grain of salt. It's unclear to us how many people were asked back here in summer of 13 just weren't comfortable saying that they were more likely to visit. So we don't know what the difference is between 9 and 20 with the people who just feel like they can be honest and say, I'm more likely to visit now. If we look at the net impact, we do see a positive trend over time, that we are seeing more positive feedback in terms of it was making me more likely to visit. So our original one, we had more people who were less likely to visit, and if we look at the most recent data point, we're moving in an upward trend. This is very interesting to me, and one of the reasons why I continued with my phase 2 research. So back in winter, and this is the first time this question was asked, this chart was asked just to people who did go to Colorado. So if they did come to Colorado during the survey window, they were asked this question: was marijuana a motivator to travel to Colorado? So the first time it was asked, we were down at 1%, and then the recent survey, we were up at 7%. The orange bars are people who actually visited a shop. So you'll see that more people visited a shop than people who said it was a motivator for them to come. So this means maybe they weren't thinking about it, or maybe they didn't think they'd have the opportunity, or maybe once they got here, the opportunity arose and they decided to visit a shop. But we've seen that in both cases, we've got a positive upward trend. And most recently in winter 16, we have 12% of people who come to Colorado visit a retail marijuana store. And for me, that's pretty significant. So just as a reminder, back here, December 15 was when I said that there was a slight competitive advantage, and that Durango Herald article is my first public statement. I believe I was right back then. That was about slight advantage. Now in my second public statement with you, I'd be able to say that this is increased based on my own personal research and what we found from SMARI. My next public statement is that we have a moderate competitive advantage, at least for the short term, because of legal marijuana, with 12% of our visitors visiting a shop while they're here. So how does this affect us locally? Those of you who know Tim Walsworth from BID, he's been doing some research on the difference in tax revenue between marijuana stores and liquor stores, just to look at those syntaxes and see if there's anything interesting there. And so back in September 15th, so about a year ago, we had 8 retail stores, 7 medical dispensaries, and 12 liquor stores. If we look at the sales tax from January to July, which I selected because I have January to July for 16, so I wanted to be able to compare those apples to apples. Retail sales tax was about $200,000, or 1.6% of the total sales tax for the city of Durango. Medical was just over $100,000, almost 1%. So that means the total marijuana is just over $300,000, with 2.4% of total sales tax. And we can compare that to the liquor store sales tax, which is $378,000, or 3% of total sales tax. So let's compare that to September of 16. We've increased our number of retail stores. We have 9 stores now. We lost 2 of our medical dispensaries, and we lost 1 and gained 1 liquor store, so we're still at 12 liquor stores. When we look at the sales tax comparison, retail marijuana increased 70% in terms of sales tax revenue. So we're over $300,000, or 2.6% of our total sales tax comes from retail marijuana. Medical dropped because we lost 2 stores, and that's down to 0.7%, but total marijuana was up over 400,000 or 3.2%, and our liquor stores stayed steady at 3.0. So this shows, and what we expect to see is that at the end of 2016, for the first time, we'll be earning more sales tax revenue from marijuana than from liquor. So in terms of what I have been up to lately, in spring 2016, we did phase 2 of the surveys. We did about 250 tourists only, so no longer looking at residents. This is really to dig deeper into the motivations. And so we looked at 250 tourists at retail shops in the region and built a profile for them. Demographics, tripographics is a made-up word in tourism literature about things like length of stay, how many people you're traveling with, are you traveling with children under the age of 18, metrics like that. And then some spending behavior, and then what I hope to publish one day with motivations. In terms of age, we found again what we expected, that the 21 to 25 category was the highest, but we have people well into their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I think that that's significant to not discount or stereotype who the users are or the people who are visiting the retail stores. With spending, one thing I want to mention on this slide is that more than 20% of our 250 surveys were taken by day trippers from northern New Mexico. And so we saw that in phase 1, our mean for tourist spending was over $100, and that dropped down here. And I think the fact that people were just on day trips from Farmington could explain why they're not making as big of a transaction in each purchase, because they can come back next week without much expense. So our average was 92. And then in terms of the length of stay, like I said, we had a lot of people who were just coming for a day trip. The question actually reads, how long will you be in the Durango area? And people would say 30 minutes. And so they were just driving here to make that purchase and then leave. So that the one day is deceiving. The day was our smallest increment. And so we would calculate those as one day. But there was one person who stayed for just over a month, and that gave us an average of about 3.4 days. And this was in the spring. We would expect longer visits over the summer. We found what we expected again, with most of the users being daily users. I do think this is really interesting, though, that there's this never category that is spiking more than these others here. And I think, just based on my own anecdotal evidence, that these people have always been curious, always been interested, maybe didn't want to be labeled as a user in their hometowns. So they come here, they know that Colorado has a vested interest in educating them, teaching them how to use the products, the benefits of the products, and they're choosing to come to the stores for their first experience as opposed to accessing cannabis in other ways. All right, in terms of motivations again, we saw this is an outcome of my free choice was the highest rated motivation. And then the next highest motivation was I chose this destination because it's legal here. And that's another reason why I'm confident telling you today I feel okay about moving from a slight competitive advantage to a moderate competitive advantage based on the second highest motivation being they're choosing this destination because it's legal here. What we found from the phase 1 is that that big giant list of motivations that was supposed to easily fit into 4 clusters didn't really, and it was basically melting into 2 different clusters. The first is intrinsic motivation. So I want to escape the boredom of my real life. So the scale went from 1 to 7, and I actually had several people write 8 and circle an 8 that they wrote in on escaping the boredom of their real life on that particular question, which was interesting. I want to be fun-seeking on vacation. I want to try it here once in my life, given to temptation. Pleasure-seeking was a really ugly variable that didn't load well, and I need to look further into that. But then extrinsic motivation, access to the products, political choice about the products, it being the right place to try it, being safer, being legal. And so this is really where I'm headed with my research, is to try to narrow down these clusters and figure out if these motivations make sense. All right, so I basically shared with you my story and what I've learned over the last 3 years of living here and being involved and basically being a sponge about anything related to marijuana and its effect on the tourism industry. So this little nugget down here of what I know and then everything else that we still don't know. And I'm going to leave you with some unanswered questions about things that are on our radar that we're thinking about, but we don't quite know what to predict for the future. One of those things is the future of banking limitations. You may have heard in the news that there have been several credit unions that have tried to get through to be able to be the banking institution for marijuana businesses, and they have been rejected. And so we're still working on figuring out a way to make the shops have to be less dependent on cash, which would also hopefully help them with some safety issues. You may have also heard that in this time window of my research, we had several thefts at gunpoint, which is unfortunate for the businesses and especially for the employees. So for safety, we would like to be able to provide additional banking options. You may have also heard that we were sued by Oklahoma and Nebraska, claiming that they had increased costs due to increased law enforcement because people were taking Colorado cannabis products across borders. That was denied by the Supreme Court. So at least for now, we've got some breathing room for whomever the next neighbor is that gets upset and wants to come after us. But at least for now, the Supreme Court's on our side. I would say in my research and just being a sponge to the industry, the biggest problem for the tourists right now is that they can legally purchase marijuana, but there are very few places where they can legally consume it. And so where they're getting in trouble is consuming it in their hotel room and then getting a $1,000 smoking fee. Consuming it in public spaces and getting arrested. Consuming on our ski resorts is actually the biggest problem because they're mostly federal land. And so my recommendation to the industry, I'm so sorry, is that we figure out more private places where they can consume products and do it safely and without threat of being caught. I thought this was a really, really fascinating endeavor for the Colorado Symphony. They had a goal to reach out to new target markets. So this was from summer 14. They had the High Note series, Classically Cannabis. It was a BYOC event, Bring Your Own Cannabis. And they were in a private space where they held the symphony and you could consume cannabis products at the symphony. I thought this was brilliant. I tried to track this for the last 2 years, and I don't believe they held this event again in 2015 or the summer of 16. And so I actually tried to contact the event management company that's a 420 friendly event company, and my email got sent back to me. So I'm not sure that event company survived either. But I wanted to bring this out as an opportunity for entrepreneurs and creative ways to maybe reach out to the 12% of people who are visiting marijuana shops when they're here on vacation, and also entrepreneurs. One area that has been successful, there are several bud and breakfasts in the state of Colorado that are independently owned lodging facilities, and they very often will have sort of garden spaces outdoors where they allow for their lodgers to use cannabis products. Another area, so these ancillary tourism businesses are not selling, they're not growing, they're not selling marijuana, but they are related to marijuana tourism. We see that very much with tour companies. And so one of the first movers in Denver was My 420 Tours. They're not the only one, but they may have been the most significant trailblazer. My 420 Tours does things like they pick up the tourists from the airport, bring them to a grow facility, bring them to the dispensary that sells the products from the grow facility where they saw, and then drop them off at their bud and breakfast where they can enjoy their purchases. And that is a model that a lot of other tour companies have followed. But My 420 Tours did that was super innovative is they acknowledged this challenge of tourists being unable to consume products in traditional lodging facilities. So they found partners with some traditional lodging facilities, hotels with names that you would recognize. And if you book the hotel reservation through my420tours.com, My 420 20 tourists takes a clean and sanitized vaporizer to the hotel on the morning of your check-in. So you check in at the front desk, they hand you your keys, and then they hand you your vaporizer. And you go up into your room, and you're legally able to vape in the room during your stay because there's no residue or odor from the smoke. And then the next day, when you check out, they go and pick up the vaporizer and then clean and sanitize it for the next visitor. So that's been pretty innovative. And as a business professor, I try to promote innovation and creativity with new markets. Down here in the Durango area, we had High Up Tours, which is owned by John Mace. That was our first mover, and he ran into some challenges. He was trying to go through traditional marketing channels for ancillary tourism business related to marijuana, and he ran into some roadblocks. He wasn't able to get his business listed on Durango.org because Durango.org is managed by the Durango Area Tourism Office, which follows the mothership of the Colorado Tourism Office that says we can't promote anything related to cannabis. So his only option to be promoted through Durango.org was to remove the cannabis material from his website. And he did choose to do that, actually, because after reviewing his business, he said that most business was coming from traditional transportation, and it wasn't worth it to lose that connection to Durango.org for the smaller segment of this business for cannabis tours, which he still does by request. We also have Regina Wells here from Durango Artisanal Tours. She moved a little bit later, and I think that was actually a smart decision. She's used some non-traditional tourism marketing channels, and was in her second season, was very successful this year, and we expect 2017 to be even more successful. She primarily uses the internet, which we saw was mostly used by tourists to access information about marijuana, and also a lot of the marijuana databases that list the shops and also the ancillary businesses. Other things that we're concerned about are training of hospitality employees. So you may have seen some of these headlines where the challenge that the tourists have is we just realized that they're spending $100 a visit, and then they can't consume everything that they purchased before they have to leave in a few days. And so not knowing what to do with their excess purchases, where it would be legal to just throw it in the trash at the airport, instead they're choosing to leave mostly edibles as gratuity for their housekeepers. It's also become common in the bar scene that you would tip your bartender with cannabis products. But where the problems were lying were things that had already been taken out of the package that were left in hotel rooms, and then housekeepers bring the gummy bears home to their children. And so we're doing training with the hospitality employees. If anything is not in a package, you dispose of it. Well, I mean, that would be common sense, but just in case your kid really likes gummy bears, you should still throw out the gummy bears. This also is happening in the rental car industry. So people are driving their rental car back to the airport, and they're like, oh no, I forgot to dispose of all of my extra cannabis. And so instead of just throwing it out in the trash when they get out of the car, they stash it in places like the hidden and secret compartments that you know you have under your seat in your car. And so what's happening is that the future drivers of those rental vehicles are finding these bags of products that were left in the vehicle. So these are things that were unintended consequences, but we still need to train our staff in the industry to be able to manage that. Just in terms of general employment, in the state of Colorado, as an employer, you have the right to have a zero-tolerance drug policy. This actually applies for whether your employee uses retail or medical marijuana. You can choose to say you cannot be employed by this business and use cannabis. And so if you are drug tested for any reason and you fail the drug test, the Colorado Supreme Court confirmed that you are legally able to fire employees for using cannabis if you have a well-documented drug policy. The issue is that a lot of big companies, especially national companies, have zero tolerance drug policies. And anecdotally, I have a student whose aunt works for Walmart in a town just outside of Denver, and they are really struggling to hire people because no one who's applying to that Walmart can pass the drug test. And so that sounds funny, but it is a serious problem in the state of Colorado with this legalization. What have we done to our applicant pool for positions? So that's something that's on our radar. And then my final point here is going to be, even though I have boldly said in my second public statement that we are a moderate competitive advantage in terms of tourism compared to our destination competitors, I don't know what's going to happen in November. And so here are the states. The dark purple are the 5 states that are putting recreational marijuana on the ballot, and then the light purple ones are putting medical on the ballot in November. And what will happen if these states and 2 or 4 years from now, even more states legalize marijuana? What does that do for our competitive advantage? I can tell you that the state of California is our biggest target market. Doesn't feel like it down here where we are. We would say probably Texas is where most of our tourists come from. But for the state of Colorado, 1.2 million more people come from California than from Texas. And so what does that do for us with our competitive advantage from our biggest target market when all of a sudden that icing on the cake to come to Colorado all of a sudden isn't a big deal to them? And so what happens if all of these states legalize, and we add that to the states that are already legal, the 4 states plus Washington, D.C. in the dark blue, and then all of those other states that already have legal medical marijuana. And so I guess the thought that I'd like to leave you with tonight is that I do believe that we have seen a positive upward trend of marijuana as a motivator for people to come to Colorado, and the purchase of marijuana by tourists when they do come to Colorado. I'd be willing to go on the record today to say that it's a moderate competitive advantage, but I don't believe that that will last that long, especially with the state of California. It'll take them a couple years to get their footing, but come 2017, 2018, when they're rolling things out and then additional states are seeing the success that the rest of us have had, especially with things like tax revenue, I believe that eventually marijuana tourism will just be tourism. It will no longer be a motivator for why people are traveling. And that is what I have presented or prepared for you today. And I'm open to any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you so much.